mother's first time at the piano. After my dad died in 1973, I wrote down the melodies that I could remember so that I could amuse myself and fondly remember Dad playing them. How I wish I had a recording of them, as I felt he really played well, even though I don't know how he learned to play, perhaps from relatives or friends. That was rather typical in small towns because he did live in North Branch, Minnesota. And it was typical also of Swedish ironsmith families to hand down violins from one generation to the next. However, in Sweden, my grandfather, my dad's father, showed no interest in the violin that was offered him. His older brother, Gustav, must have played, as you'll hear later, Gustav Varmy's waltz. Both Mary and I are granddaughters of Swedish immigrants. I'm 100% Swedish, and Mary is very close to that. My 4 grandparents and 5 great-grandparents emigrated from Sweden between 1869 and 1879, a 10-year period, to Minnesota, and most of them were from the southern province of Småland in Kronoberg and Kalmar-Län County, or Länner counties. And I didn't get that mounted. I could have put it up there. The names were the Ironsmith Warme, W-A-R-M-E, or it's spelled W-E-R-M-E. It has about 8 different spellings. And also Carlson and Peterson. My mother's mother, or Mormor, brothers and her brothers and father, Johannes Andersen, came from the eastern Dalsland, about 7 miles from the Norwegian border. And great-grandfather John, he was known in America as John Andersen, wrote a long, tender, plaintive 24-verse poem to his family and friends. And he mentions his daughter by name, Maria Serafia, and his son Severin by name. He mentions, he says something about his poor wife. Well, she was ill when he left, and he left without getting permission to go, which is something that you don't do. So he was listed as a vagrant on the church records, I think until he died, until they no longer were writing these records. But with this, a similar 25-verse poem, he wrote 24, a similar 25-verse poem was printed and published in Växjö, Sweden in 1869. That's the same year that he left Sweden. And whether it's coincidence or not, I've not figured that out. But I did find this long poem put to music in a book, and it starts out pretty much the same. So I have the feeling somewhere along the line he got one of these copies. And I did read that in the immigration cities that they sold these songs. But as I say, the fact that he adapted it to his family I thought was kind of nice. And I did have a copy, which I can't seem to put my hand on, but I've typed it so I know what it contains. So whether my great-grandfather adapted the poem at the immigration court or whether they adapted, who knows? I'll never know. Ultimately, all of the immigrant families settled in small neighboring communities of Chisago County, which is north of the Twin Cities. They settled in North Branch and Stark and Harris. You'd have to know Stark is just a little crossroads and not very large at all. But I was born in Minneapolis during World War I, when my father's address was somewhere in France. It was after the armistice, but he still was over there. He didn't come home until I was about 4 months old. 2 years later, the 3 of us, my mother and father and I, moved to Milwaukee. And how did Swedish music enter my life? Well, my first recollections are of songs that my mother sang while she was working at home, baking in the kitchen, and caring for me and my sister Norma, who is 3.5 years younger. My mother, Hannah Carlson, was the 6th of Frank and Mary Carlson's 10 children. She loved music and poetry, but her singing was limited to choir in her home church, which is Fish Lake Lutheran, where she was married and I was baptized. Both marriage and baptismal certificates are in Swedish. And I'm going to give most of the program from the piano, and Mary will join me at certain times. I hope we have our signal straight. So I particularly remember some of the Swedish Christmas hymns. Concert band and violin. And they loved to sing around the piano, and most sang in the choir. There's even a church picture from one of the anniversaries where the choir is there, and I'd say about half of them are my relatives. They also had an Edison phonograph with cylinder records, big ones, and a speaker, which they often played on the porch, and the neighbors used to say it was nice because as they drove by, they would hear this. I don't know what kind of a speaker it would be. I have never seen that. A guitar is also mentioned in a touching poem that Grandma Mary wrote in 1921, 2 years after my grandpa died. And it was called A Song for Frank Carlson. It's a very poignant poem. She